The night before the stories. The night is quiet, as if the air itself has learned to whisper. A faint breeze moves through the room, maybe from a window left half open, maybe from the slow rotation of an old ceiling fan. Its rhythm is steady, almost like breathing. The light is soft and low, not enough to see everything, but enough to feel that everything is still here. Tonight we wander through fragments of time. Not the grand moments history remembers, not the noise of victory nor the echo of loss, but the quiet hours that live between them. We visit the places where people once moved slowly, spoke softly, and simply watched the world unfold. There is no story to chase, no lesson to force. Only the steady pulse of time, flowing without asking to be understood. In one corner of memory, a lamp burns low on a wooden table. Someone writes with a brush, the sound of ink faint against the paper. In another, a woman hums to herself while folding cloth, the song rising and falling with the rhythm of her hands. Far away, a man tends a small fire, the smoke drifting into a night that has seen countless others before it. These moments do not belong to any era. They are simply pieces of the same silence we breathe now. The night has its own language. It does not need to speak to be heard. Each sound, a sigh, a rustle, a faint creak, is part of its conversation with time. To listen is to slow down, to stop holding on to the noise of the day. You do not have to understand what the night is saying. You only have to be here long enough to feel it. So let everything soften. Let the mind loosen its grip. The world outside can wait. It always does. What remains now is this: a gentle hum, a slow breath, a space wide enough to rest in. Tonight, we walk not to arrive anywhere, but to remember that even stillness has motion, and even silence has depth. Feudal Japan, when life was orderly. Morning in the village begins before the sun has fully opened its eyes. The air is damp, filled with the faint sweetness of rice fields and wet soil. Mist drifts low across the ground, soft as breath. From the thatched roofs, droplets fall rhythmically, marking time in a place where clocks do not matter. Somewhere a rooster calls once, then again, as if to remind the world that light is coming. Inside small wooden houses, people are already awake. Not hurried, not reluctant, just quietly returning to the rhythm that has guided their lives for generations. The farmers stretch their backs, rinse their faces with cool water from clay basins, and tie their hair with worn cloths. The sound of footsteps on the packed earth is gentle, steady. They move without talking much because words are unnecessary when the day already knows what it wants from you. Outside, the fields wait, endless, shimmering with dew. Water mirrors the grey-blue sky, rippling as the first hand touches it. The farmers wade in slowly, feeling the mud close around their feet. They begin to plant rice, each movement small and exact. The rhythm of their hands becomes part of the morning itself. Bend, plant, rise, breathe. The sound of splashing water, the whisper of leaves, the quiet exhale of effort, all blend into one patient heartbeat. There is no rush here. Time passes differently. The village does not demand achievement, it asks only for presence. Each gesture, pressing a seed into mud, tightening a bundle of straw, calling softly to an ox, carries the memory of those who came before. Tradition is not a story told aloud, but a motion repeated until it becomes instinct. When the sun climbs higher, the mist thins, revealing colors that feel older than the land itself, the pale green of new rice, the dark brown of the earth, the faded blue of work clothes. A child runs barefoot by the path, chasing a dragonfly. An old man sits by the doorway, sipping tea that has long gone cold, his gaze following the same horizon he's known all his life. Back at home, breakfast waits, a bowl of rice porridge, perhaps a slice of pickled radish, maybe some greens simmered in salt. Steam rises like a thin breath. Families gather on straw mats, eating slowly, their silence not emptiness, but ease. Outside, the wind moves through bamboo leaves, soft as memory. Nothing extraordinary happens, and that is the beauty of it. The morning does not try to impress. It only unfolds quietly, as it always has. The fields fill with light, the hands continue their work, and life begins again, simple, unspoken, perfectly complete in its repetition. As the morning deepens, the village slowly stirs beyond the fields. From one narrow lane, a faint, scraping sound begins, the pull of a spinning wheel turning thread from cotton. The thread hums softly, almost like a song without melody. Nearby, the carpenter lifts a plank of wood, its weight familiar in his hands. He works with slow precision, each stroke of his plane releasing the scent of fresh timber. The rhythm of his work folds neatly into the sound of the day, the wheel, the saw, the rustle of straw being swept from a doorstep. In the small marketplace, a merchant arranges his goods, woven baskets, clay pots, bundles of herbs tied with twine. His movements are unhurried. He counts coins not as a measure of wealth, but of the day's flow. Across from him, another trader weighs a handful of rice on a wooden scale. The beam tips slightly, settles, then stills. A small balance restored. The air here carries no urgency. It is filled only with the quiet exchanges between hands, the soft murmur of greetings, and the hollow clack of bamboo chimes swaying in the wind. Each person has their place, the weaver with her threads, the potter with his wheel, the shopkeeper, the broom maker, the woman who sells steamed buns at the corner stall. They do not compete, they simply continue. Life here is not built on striving, but on sustaining, an agreement that everyone moves at the same gentle pace, that the day will stretch far enough for all. A child watches her grandmother twist straw into rope, her small fingers trying to mimic the motion. The old woman smiles but says nothing, letting the lesson sink in through repetition. A man passes by carrying wood for the evening fire. He nods to her in greeting, and she nods back, a whole conversation held in silence. Words are used sparingly here, like spices added just enough to flavor the air. The broom sweeps again, brushing dust into small clouds that rise and disappear in the sunlight. The wheel turns, the scale balances, a cup of tea cools beside a half-finished piece of work. The whole village breathes in a rhythm that feels as natural as the tide. The slow inhale of effort, the soft exhale of rest. Nothing remarkable happens, yet nothing is missing. The beauty lies in the stillness between actions, in the quiet dignity of people who understand their place, not as limitation, but as belonging. The sound of the fields fades into the hum of labor, and the hum of labor fades into silence again. By noon, the air grows warmer, the light brighter, but the calm remains. A steady pulse beneath everything, like the memory of a sigh that never quite ends. By midday, the air is warm enough to slow everything down. Shadows shorten, and the soft hum of labor begins to fade into a quieter order. Beyond the marketplace and the fields, where the air smells faintly of wood and earth, another presence shapes the village, not of trade or harvest, but of discipline. In a courtyard surrounded by low walls, a samurai adjusts his robe. The fabric folds cleanly, dark against the brightness of noon. He moves with a patience that seems almost sacred, one hand smoothing the sleeve, the other resting near the hilt of his sword. The blade is not drawn, it does not need to be. Its presence alone defines the space, as if silence itself were being guarded. There is no shouting, no clashing of metal, only stillness, the kind that demands attention, not from others but from oneself. Every movement, from the tightening of a sash to the lowering of a knee, is deliberate. Even the act of standing still becomes a form of dialogue between balance and breath. Nearby, another figure bows. The gesture is slow, precise, not exaggerated, not hesitant. In this small act lives an entire world of respect for life, for death, for the invisible thread connecting both. The bow is repeated, mirrored, perfected through years until it ceases to be a gesture and becomes a way of being. The samurai's world is built on form. His clothes, his posture, his silence all speak the same language. The sword he carries is polished daily, not because it must be used, but because it deserves reverence. It represents clarity, restraint, and readiness, not aggression. When the blade is set down, the gesture is careful, as though returning a truth to its resting place. The courtyard remains quiet except for the soft creak of bamboo and the distant chirp of insects. The discipline here is not loud, not heroic. It is lived. A sleeve adjusted too quickly, a step taken without thought. Even such small errors are felt deeply. Order is not an obligation, it is devotion. When the wind passes through the open gate, the samurai's hair moves slightly, but his stance does not. The body obeys the mind, and the mind obeys the calm. This is the essence of their code, a harmony between action and stillness, strength and surrender. As afternoon light filters through the leaves, the village feels the same quiet discipline. The merchant in the market counts coins carefully, the carpenter lays his tools in a neat line, the child places his sandals side by side before stepping inside. Each gesture, no matter how small, reflects the same invisible order, as though the samurai's silence has extended into every home. The day continues, steady and wordless. The sounds are soft, the brush of fabric, the weight of a footstep, the faint ring of steel being cleaned. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is done for show. It is a way of living where even rest is measured, where peace itself is the sharpest form of precision. By the time the sun begins to descend, the samurai's shadow stretches long across the courtyard. He bows once more, not to anyone, but to the fading light, and leaves quietly, his presence absorbed back into the stillness of the village. Evening will come soon, carrying its own kind of silence. But for now, discipline lingers in the air like incense, unseen, steady, and endlessly alive. When the work and order of the day begin to fade, another rhythm takes over, quieter, gentler, but just as deliberate. The air has cooled by now, and the village starts to prepare for its evening cleansing. From narrow alleys and wooden doors, the faint sound of water begins to rise, the slow filling of basins, the steady pouring into stone tubs. The samurai, the farmer, the merchant, each finds their own way to the same ritual, not one of worship, but of renewal. The water is cold, drawn fresh from wells or mountain streams. When it touches the skin, the breath catches for a moment, then steadies. Steam curls softly where warmth meets chill, rising in small spirals that disappear into the fading light. A man dips his hands into a basin, splashing his face with short, controlled movements. The sound is sharp at first, then calm. A woman wrings out a cloth, wiping her arms slowly, her eyes half closed. A child giggles as the cold water runs down his back. But even that laughter softens quickly, swallowed by the stillness that fills the air. Inside the public bathhouse, warmth blooms like quiet conversation. The room smells faintly of cedar and clean stone. Water flows constantly, not rushing, not stilled, just enough to remind you that life continues in motion. People move carefully, almost ceremoniously, though there are no prayers, no chants. Each gesture, the lifting of a bucket, the washing of hair, the careful rinsing of shoulders, feels like the undoing of the day's weight. Outside, the light fades completely. The faint mist from the bathhouse drifts into the night air, mingling with the scent of smoke from distant fires. It spreads across the village like a sigh, warm and invisible. Within that haze, everything seems softer. Footsteps, voices, even the wind that passes through bamboo leaves. Clean skin against cool air, damp hair tied back, the mind quiet again, the body light. There is no grand purpose to this act, no doctrine hidden beneath it. It is simply the habit of returning to oneself, of washing away what the hours have gathered. When they step out, the villagers do not speak much. They carry their towels, their calm, and the faint warmth that lingers on their skin. The night receives them gently, as if recognizing the peace they have earned through the simplest form of discipline, the care of being clean, alive, and unburdened. In that moment, between water and air, silence and breath, the day finally comes to rest. When the air from the bathhouse begins to cool and drift into the evening, life in the village folds gently into its last rhythm of the day. Lanterns flicker one by one along narrow paths, their glow touching wooden walls and woven screens. From the doorways, people emerge in clean garments, not decorated, not loud, but soft and simple in tone. The fabrics are plain, woven from cotton or hemp, dyed in the quiet colors of the earth. Grey, sand, faded indigo. No one dresses to stand out, they dress to belong. The samurai's robe hangs evenly on his frame, his movements composed and light. The merchant adjusts his sash, the same one he has tied every evening for years. The farmer's clothes, worn but clean, carry the faint scent of smoke and soap. Nothing about them asks to be admired. Each thread has its place, each crease falls where it should. Even the act of dressing becomes a continuation of the discipline that has guided the whole day. A way to meet the night with respect. Inside the homes, lamps are lit. The light is low, amber, and kind to the eyes. The family gathers around a small table. The meal is modest, a bowl of rice, a piece of grilled fish, perhaps some pickled vegetables and miso soup. Steam rises slowly, moving like thought. Chopsticks meet bowls with the softest sounds, a delicate tapping that replaces the day's noise. There is no conversation for a while, just the rhythm of eating, measured, steady, human. The villagers do not rush through the meal. They pause between bites, listening to the night that hums faintly outside, the whisper of wind, the crackle of a distant fire, the occasional bark of a dog. The stillness is not empty, it is full of presence. A small gesture, the passing of a dish, a nod of thanks, carries more than words. When they do speak, voices are low, sentences brief. The language of the village has no need for flourish. Each word is like a stone placed carefully on calm water, precise, sufficient, and soon absorbed by silence. A bow here, a soft smile there. Communication reduced to essence. After the meal, bowls are washed in quiet rhythm. Water splashes once, twice, and then stills. The lamps burn lower. The samurai lays his sword beside his bed with a small nod. The merchant folds his ledger closed. The child presses close to his mother's arm. Outside, the The mist from the bathhouse lingers in the air, merging with the smoke from cooking fires. And then, as if by agreement, the village lets the night settle. No one fills the darkness with noise. Every breath, every movement grows slower. The day closes not with conclusion, but with surrender. To stillness, to warmth, to the quiet grace of having done just enough. In that silence, the village finally exhales and the world once again returns to balance. Outside the small homes, the air shifts again. The night gives way to the slow turning of seasons, that quiet, endless motion which no one commands. The people of the village do not resist it. They live within it, like branches bending to the wind. Rain falls, sometimes for days, soft at first, and then certain. It gathers in the fields, turning soil to mirrors, sky to reflection. The farmers walk barefoot through the water, their footsteps lost beneath the rippling surface. Then come the storms. The air thickens, the sky bruises grey, and the sound of wind fills every hollow space. Roofs tremble, trees bend, but the people remain calm. They wait, knowing that even fury passes. The storm is not an enemy, only a reminder that the world moves according to forces greater than choice. When winter arrives, the land grows still. Frost gathers at the edges of windows, breath becomes visible, slow and white. The fields rest, empty and silent. In the mornings, smoke rises from low chimneys, curling through the air like memory. People wrap themselves in heavier cloth, share warmth, eat closer together. The rhythm of life shrinks but does not stop, just enough motion to keep the heart beating through the cold. And then, without announcement, the thaw begins. The wind changes direction, carrying the faint scent of water and earth. Birds return, calling softly to one another from unseen places. Hands prepare the fields once more, pressing seeds into wet soil. The same gestures year after year, but never exactly the same. Each season repeats, yet something within the repetition always shifts. The pace of the wind, the pattern of rain, the tone of the morning light. Nature does not hurry, does not explain. It moves with the certainty of something too vast to measure. To live here is to accept that truth, that the sky, the river, the soil are not kind or cruel. They simply are. Larger than thought, older than memory, patient beyond reason. The people bow to this quiet vastness, not in worship, but in recognition. The land speaks first, and they answer by listening. Artemisia of Caria, the woman on the sea. The sea lies flat beneath the morning light, wide, pale, and without a single ripple to break its calm. Mist drifts low across the water, soft as breath, blurring the line between ocean and sky. The horizon is a faint, silver edge, almost lost in the haze. Time itself seems to hesitate here, suspended between night and day. From that stillness, a fleet begins to emerge, a slow procession of ships moving through the fog like shadows that have forgotten where they began. Their sails catch the weak light, the sound of oars dipping into water, barely audible over the hush of the sea. The movement is steady, unhurried, not a display of might, but of purpose. At the center of the formation stands a single vessel, larger than the rest, its flag almost invisible in the mist. On its deck, Artemisia watches, silent, composed, her presence sharper than the steel hidden beneath the waves. She does not shout commands, she does not need to. Her crew moves as though guided by her breath alone. Each man knows his task, each oar finds its rhythm. The sea obeys their quiet discipline. The air smells of salt and wet wood. The ropes creak softly, a reminder that everything alive has its voice, even silence. Artemisia's eyes scan the horizon, not searching for threat or glory, but reading the language of the wind, the slow tilt of the water, the promise of a day still forming. Her armor catches the light for a moment, then dims again, blending into the grey. No storm approaches, no enemy sails near. Yet tension hums gently beneath the calm, the kind that exists when everything depends on patience. Artemisia stands still, her hand resting lightly on the railing. She listens. To the creak of the hull, to the faint cry of a gull somewhere unseen, to the rhythm of the sea breathing under her ship. This is not a scene of battle, but of waiting. The stillness before motion, the breath before command. Around her, the men move with quiet respect, aware that she leads not by volume, but by presence. The fog thickens, swallowing the edges of the world, and for a long moment it feels as though only she and the sea exist. The ships glide forward, slow and deliberate, carrying both silence and destiny upon their decks. The mist begins to lift, thinning into threads that drift across the pale expanse of water. Light gathers slowly, stretching across the surface like a second horizon. From the center ship, Artemisia stands unmoving, her gaze tracing the lines of the sea, the direction of the wind, the subtle pull of the current, the tremor that hints at the coming tide. Her body is still, but her mind moves like the water itself, precise, alert, unbroken. She studies everything in silence, the angle of a sail in the distance, the color of the sky shifting from pearl to grey-blue, the faint drag beneath the hull that tells her how deep the water runs. Each detail is weighed, compared, and filed within her. There is no need for speech, no need for gesture. Command, for her, is not noise but knowing, a way of aligning thought with motion until they are the same. The crew waits, their hands steady on the ropes, their eyes glancing toward her from time to time. They have learned that her silence is not distance, but clarity. She speaks only when the words are heavier than quiet. And now, in this thin hour before the day begins in full, her quiet is the only thing holding the fleet together. The wind shifts, just slightly, a new current curling beneath the surface. She feels it before she sees it. Her eyes narrow, and for a moment she lifts her face to the breeze, reading what it carries. The scent of salt, the rhythm of pressure, the weight of what's coming. Then a small movement, the tilt of her chin, almost imperceptible, and the helmsman adjusts course. The ship turns, smooth and sure, as though guided by instinct. Then the sea begins to stir. Waves rise, first gently, then with growing insistence. The oars strain, the ropes tighten, the air grows heavy with salt and motion. Around her, sailors brace themselves, gripping wood, slick with spray. Yet she does not flinch. Her hands rest lightly at her sides, her breathing even. The wind lashes at her cloak, the water roars against the hull. But her gaze remains fixed ahead. Artemisia's calm is not indifference. It is control, carved from years of living with the sea's moods, its deceptions, its tempers, its quiet betrayals. She does not fight the waves, she calculates them. Every rise, every fall becomes part of the pattern she already knows by heart. Her thoughts move in rhythm with the ocean's pulse. To others, it looks like courage. To her, it is simply understanding. As the swell grows higher, her voice finally cuts through the storm. Low, firm, carrying farther than any shout. Orders given without panic, received without question. The sails adjust, the oars move as one, the ships turn with the precision of breath, gliding between the walls of water like creatures born from them. Rain begins to fall. Thin at first, then heavy, sharp against the skin. The sky darkens and the line between sea and air vanishes entirely. Yet the fleet holds its shape. Artemisia stands at its heart, unshaken, her figure outlined against the grey horizon. In her stillness lies the command that words could never carry. Stay the course. Hours later, when the waves finally begin to ease, the light returns in fragments. Soft, broken, beautiful. The sea settles again, exhausted but alive. Her ship drifts forward, its path clean, its order intact. The men look to her, waiting for acknowledgement, but she does not speak. She only exhales once, slow and quiet, as the mist gathers again on the surface of the water. For Artemisia, victory has never been about conquest. It is about endurance, about keeping the vessel upright when everything else tilts and breaks. She closes her eyes for a moment, feeling the sea calm beneath her, and in that silence, her strength becomes almost invisible, like the deep current that carries the world without ever being seen. When the storm finally passes and the sea regains its calm, the fleet gathers again near the coast. The mist has thinned into pale ribbons that cling to the water, and sunlight, faint but steady, returns to the deck. The men move more slowly now, not from weariness, but from the quiet weight that always follows survival. Ropes are tightened, sails repaired, wounds cleaned. The ships, though weathered, still stand in order, held together by discipline and by her will. Artemisia remains silent as the fleet anchors. She watches the horizon until the last trace of turbulence disappears, then turns toward the shore. A small pavilion has been prepared, simple yet deliberate, where the commanders have gathered. Their faces are drawn, some hardened by pride, some clouded by fear. Maps lie open across a wooden table, the ink still damp from hurried hands. When she enters, no one speaks. Her presence settles the air. The sound of her steps on the wooden floor is measured, each one a reminder of composure. She does not rush to sit. Instead, she studies the map, the lines of the coastline, the arrows marking enemy movement. Her expression does not change. Only her eyes move, calm, calculating, precise. At last, one of the generals breaks the silence, his voice edged with frustration. He speaks of retaliation, of striking back quickly before the sea turns again. Others nod, eager for action, their pride stung by the storm's chaos. Artemisia listens, unmoved. She waits until the noise of their ambition fades, until the room itself begins to grow aware of its own impatience. Then she speaks, her words are few, her tone low. Not the force of command, but the gravity of reason. Every wave that breaks against us costs a man. Every impulse we follow without thought weakens the line that holds us together. Her voice does not rise, yet each syllable lands with clarity, cutting through the remnants of noise. We are not here to prove fury, we are here to endure it. The table grows still. The men listen. She points to the map, her finger tracing the currents they've crossed, the narrow straits where the wind favors them. The sea is not an ally, but it has its habits. Learn them, and it will give you passage. Defy them, and it will take from you what it pleases. She pauses, then adds quietly, Our duty is not to chase victory, but to preserve strength. To fight again tomorrow, and the day after, until endurance itself becomes triumph. There is no flourish in her speech, no attempt to inspire. Only the cool certainty of one who understands the limits of power. Around her, the younger commanders lower their eyes. The older ones nod slowly, their pride bending toward wisdom. Outside, the wind stirs the edge of the pavilion. The sea glimmers faintly beyond, calm now but vast, an endless reminder of proportion. Artemisia gathers the map, rolls it neatly, and places it back on the table. "We hold the line," she says. "We wait for the wind to turn. We lose no ships. We lose no men." And then she steps back, allowing silence to reclaim the room. Her presence fades, but her words remain. Simple, steady, undeniable. When the meeting ends, the generals disperse quietly. No orders shouted, no banners raised, only the understanding that restraint too is a kind of victory. Outside, the waves brush softly against the hulls as if in agreement. The sea, for now, is still, and so is she. The days pass, and the campaign draws to its quiet end. The ships, once bound by tension and salt, begin their slow return. The sea that once roared beneath them now lies calm again, a mirror stretched endlessly under a pale sky. No drums, no banners, no cries of triumph. Only the sound of wood against water, soft and rhythmic, like the breath of something ancient and tired. Artemisia stands at the bow of her ship, where she has stood through every tide, every silence, every storm. Her cloak moves faintly in the wind, the edges damp with sea spray. Behind her, the crew works in near silence. Men who have learned that the loudest victories are often followed by the quietest landings. Their faces are calm, lined with exhaustion, marked by the relief of continuity. The coastline of home appears slowly, not as a promise, but as a memory returning. The familiar outline of cliffs, the faint scent of pine carried from the hills. The water here is shallow, gentler, tinted gold by the late afternoon light. She watches without expression, her eyes following the thin line where the sky meets the earth. To others, it looks like indifference. To her, it is peace. When they reach the harbour, no one waits with garlands or music. There are no crowds, no celebration. The docks are quiet except for the low voices of those unloading cargo, the creak of ropes, the flap of a torn sail. Artemisia steps ashore alone. Her boots leave faint marks on the damp planks, quickly erased by the tide. She pauses, turning once toward the open sea. The horizon has already begun to fade into the mist again. For a long moment, she simply watches. The same sea that once tested her now lies still, vast, unjudging, complete. It has taken lives, spared others, and in the end returned to calm as if none of it ever happened. There is a kind of mercy in that forgetfulness. No chronicler waits to record her words. No poet comes to shape her deeds into story. The sea does not applaud, and neither does she. Yet among the few who know her name, there will always be one simple truth, spoken quietly, passed between those who understand the cost of endurance. She survived. The journey has no grand finale, no burst of light or final command. It ends as it began, with water, wind, and silence. The crew disperses, their tasks complete, their eyes already turning toward land. The ships rest at anchor, the waves lapping gently against their sides. Artemisia walks inland, her steps steady. Behind her, the ocean continues its eternal rhythm, rising, falling, forgetting. Ahead, the path narrows into quiet fields, the air carrying the faint hum of life returning to order. She does not look back again. There is no need. The sea has already taken her measure, and she has met it without fear. By nightfall, mist gathers once more across the bay, veiling the ships and shore alike. From a distance, it is impossible to tell where the land ends or the water begins. Only the faint glimmer of a lantern marks the place where she once stood. A reminder that some lives leave no monument, only the calm certainty that they endured what others could not. And somewhere in that vast, breathing stillness, the sea holds her story, not as legend, but as memory. Quiet, steady and alive beneath the endless tide. Years pass, the sea forgets as it always does, and the world moves on to other names, other storms. In the scrolls of history, her story begins to fade, not erased, but thinned, like ink washed by time. Scholars trace her name across brittle pages, uncertain of its pronunciation, debating the details of battles that no longer matter. What remains is not legend, not worship, but a quiet acknowledgement that once there was a woman who faced the sea and did not flinch. Artemisia of Caria. The name surfaces here and there in old chronicles, often as a brief note between greater wars, an annotation on the margins of empire. She is mentioned not for her bloodline or victories, but for her clarity. Her choices were measured, her commands deliberate, her silence more persuasive than any speech. She did not seek glory, and perhaps because of that, the centuries grant her something rarer: respect without embellishment. In the minds of later generations, she becomes almost abstract, a symbol of composure in chaos, of reason prevailing over noise. Some remember her as a tactician, others as a shadow moving among kings. But beneath every retelling lies the same thread, a woman who led not by fear, but by the calmness of understanding. The sea she once ruled shows no trace of her. Its tides erase everything, the ships, the voices, the echo of commands shouted into wind. Yet, in the hush between waves, one might still sense her discipline lingering, a quiet pulse beneath the water's skin. In temples and libraries her name is written small, between those of louder men. But perhaps that is fitting, for Artemisia never belonged to noise. Her life, like the sea she mastered, was an expanse of silence, shaped by will. Time no longer measures her deeds, it measures the endurance of her restraint. No monuments rise where she stood. Only the faint memory that wisdom, when carried without vanity, leaves its own kind of permanence. Not carved in stone, but in the calm that follows understanding. And so, in the unending passage of years, her presence remains where history grows quiet. In the margins, in the pauses, in the still water that reflects nothing but light. The ancient sky when humanity looked up in silence. Across distant lands, under skies that have changed countless times, people still look upward, to the same vastness, though from different soil. The gesture is ancient and shared, the lifting of the head, the narrowing of the eyes, the quiet pause before the endless. Mountains, deserts, islands, and cities, each place holds its own way of remembering what it once saw above. In one land, the story is carved into stone. The chisels cut deep, each mark holding both sound and silence. The faces of gods and men are drawn together in patterns that try to explain the movement of light. Over time, the carvings fade, but their shapes remain. A language of endurance written into the skin of the earth. Elsewhere, memory is pressed into clay. Hands shape the soft earth, pressing lines and symbols while it is still wet, before the fire hardens it forever. Those tablets rest in darkness now, buried beneath centuries, still carrying the weight of thought. Each mark was once a person's attempt to fix meaning against time, a way of saying, we saw this too. In the forests, where the air smells of sap and rain, memory takes root in wood. The trunks of ancient trees bear thin carvings, spirals, eyes, constellations, reminders of the sky that once guided travelers home. The wood ages, darkens, cracks. Yet even as the grain splits, the memory holds, whispering faintly through the years. And in the places without stone or clay or trees, memory survives in breath. Old voices repeat stories beside firelight, of stars that moved like messengers, of winds that carried omens. Each retelling changes slightly, shaped by the voice that carries it. Yet the meaning remains. That to look upward is to remember our smallness and our connection to something vast. Different lands, different forms, rock, clay, wood, word, but the same impulse beneath them all, to preserve the moment when the sky spoke and humanity answered. The materials crumble, the languages fade, but the gesture endures. Even now, across cities of glass and metal, people still look up when the evening light softens. They may not carve or sing or write, but the instinct remains, to search the heavens not for answers, but for reflection. To see the same expanse that others once saw, and in that act of looking, to remember that we have always been trying to keep the sky from being forgotten. From those first upward glances came the watchers, the ones who turned their gaze into study, who made the sky into a language. Far to the east, between the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, people began to map the heavens. This was the cradle of Mesopotamia, the land where night was never empty, and the stars were not decoration, but memory and measure. When darkness fell across the plains, the air cooled and the hum of the day faded. On rooftops made of clay and reed, figures stood in silence, eyes fixed on the vast field above. The constellations shifted slowly, following patterns only patience could see. Each movement was recorded not in stories, but in marks. Small impressions pressed into wet clay with a stylus. Triangles, wedges, strokes, the quiet birth of writing. The observers did not seek myth, they sought rhythm. They noticed how the stars appeared in certain alignments before the river swelled, how the moon's arc foretold the length of rain, how the rising of a single star could whisper the return of planting season. The sky was not divine to them in a distant sense. It was practical, intimate, a silent teacher repeating its lessons every night. By torchlight, they pressed their records onto tablets one by one. The clay was cool beneath their hands, the air filled with the faint crackle of fire and the scent of earth. Around them, the city of Babylon slept, its streets empty, its walls heavy with heat from the day. Yet up above, the heavens breathed with motion, 1,000 years unfolding in slow, patient rhythm. Their records were not loud or heroic, no proclamations, no triumphs, only lines and signs arranged with care, a quiet conversation between human and cosmos. The tablets stacked neatly on shelves, each one a captured fragment of the moving night. Generations would come and go, but the clay endured, holding its breath through centuries. In those symbols they found order. Not the kind that conquers, but the kind that understands. By watching the stars, they learned to watch themselves. By predicting the river's rise, they learned humility before nature's cycles. Their knowledge was a form of listening, and their writing was a form of silence, shaped into permanence. Even now, when those tablets are unearthed from beneath the dust, they carry the same stillness. The soft hum of 1,000 nights spent in observation. Each mark, though small, holds the weight of time and intention. The people of Babylon looked upward not to escape the earth, but to live more deeply within it. Their sky was a map of return, of flood and harvest, of birth and decay. And in that endless watching, they became the first to understand that time itself moves in circles, not lines. Their language of stars still whispers through the centuries, quiet and enduring, a reminder that long before we spoke of science or faith, we were already listening to the night. Further west, where the desert meets the river, another people looked upward and found their order in light. Egypt, the land of gold dust and flowing water, was built on the rhythm of the sun, the moon, and one particular star that rose with extraordinary precision: Sirius, the shining one. Its return to the horizon each year marked not a myth, but a truth the people could live by. The Nile would soon rise. Life would return. Before dawn, when the air was still cool and the sand had not yet remembered the day's heat, priests and builders stood along the riverbanks, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The sky was still deep blue, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if the night itself had cracked, a single light appeared, faint at first, then sharp, like a blade drawn across darkness. Sirius had returned. The watchers bowed their heads slightly, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. The season had begun again. They recorded this moment not with words, but with alignment. Stones were placed, shadows measured, corridors built to catch the exact angle of sunlight on the right day, at the right hour. Temples faced east, pyramids pointed to stars, and within each structure was the logic of the heavens translated into stone. The architecture of Egypt was not only a monument to kings, but to time itself, a vast clock made of earth and sky. The priests of Heliopolis noted each rising, each shadow, each breath of the sun across the dunes. They did not beg the heavens for mercy, they observed it, measured it, honored its consistency. In their hands, the sacred and the practical became one. The heavens were not there to be worshipped, but to be understood, to be read like a text written in light. At night, the desert cooled, and the stars emerged sharp against the velvet sky. The same men who watched the sun's fierce ascent by day now traced the moon's calm drift by night. They marked its cycles in ink and stone, counting not days but relationships, between shadow and brightness, between distance and return. And as they recorded these movements, they shaped a civilization around them. Farmers waited for the flood when Sirius rose. Builders carved corridors to catch the solstice. Navigators crossed the Nile, guided by the same constellations that once watched over the tombs. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was written by the sky. To live in Egypt was to live within precision, not as control, but as harmony. The people trusted the stars because they trusted the pattern, the order beneath what seemed infinite. Their faith was not in unseen gods alone, but in the visible certainty of light returning year after year, exactly as it had promised. Even now, when the ancient temples stand half buried in sand, the light still finds its way through their corridors on the same day each year. The stones remember what people have forgotten. And in that silence, the pause before sunrise, the gleam of Sirius on the horizon, one can still feel the same calm intelligence that built a world from the language of the sky. The pattern of watching spread across the world, from the desert's edge to the jungle's heart, from the plains of the east to the mountains where clouds touched stone. Everywhere, people lifted their eyes to the same sky, and in that vast sameness, each civilization found its own way to measure meaning. The languages were different, the symbols and stones unlike one another, but the impulse was the same: to read the heavens, to find order in their quiet and eternal motion. In the jungles of Central America, the Maya built their eyes toward the sky in the form of stone pyramids. High above the canopy, temples rose like mountains made by hand, steps leading upward not to worship, but to observation. From these heights, priests watched the stars appear and vanish across the horizon, tracing the paths of Venus, the moon, and the sun. They carved what they saw onto stone, spirals, glyphs, and numbers. their language looping like constellations themselves. When the solstice came, sunlight struck the staircases of their temples at exact angles. Shadows formed serpents that slithered down the stone. Time was not imagined, it was visible, alive. The Maya knew that light could speak, that the turning of the sky was a story written above and reflected below. Their calendar, intricate, circular, endless, was not a prophecy but a map of rhythm. It reminded them that every ending was a return, that creation and decay shared the same heartbeat. Half a world away, beneath another set of stars, the people of ancient China watched the heavens with equal devotion, though theirs was quiet and methodical. They built observatories long before telescopes, tall towers and bronze instruments designed to measure the unmeasurable. On clear nights, astronomers stood wrapped in thick robes, their breath visible in the cold air, noting the position of each star with brushes dipped in ink. Their records were not of gods or omens, but of patterns, eclipses, comets, lunar tides. From these, they wove calendars so precise that emperors ruled their dynasties by them. The movement of heaven mirrored the movement of empire. To understand the stars was to understand the balance of the world. A ruler who ignored the sky risked chaos. Order, harmony, and virtue all began with alignment between the heavens and the earth. By day, they used water clocks to measure hours, dripping one drop at a time into bronze bowls. By night, they turned their gaze upward again, tracing constellations known not for mythic figures, but for the tasks they represented: the plough, the loom, the marketplace. Their astronomy was practical, moral, and deeply human. It taught that the universe was not distant from life, but reflected in it, that to live rightly was to move in rhythm with the stars. Farther south and west in India, the watchers looked upward from the banks of the Ganges, their temples rising from earth like carved prayers. They too studied the heavens, not as separate from the spirit but as its extension. Astronomers and monks shared the same sky, one with scrolls, the other with silence. They built sundials and water clocks, observing the dance of the planets and the breath of the moon. To them, the cosmos was not a riddle to solve, but a truth to participate in. The stars were seen as part of consciousness itself, mirrors of the mind's order and chaos. They gave names to the constellations that spoke not of power, but of harmony, karma, and return. The seasons were marked by celestial crossings. Festivals began when certain stars rose. Prayers followed the tilt of the moon. Their mathematics, born from this watching, grew subtle and vast, numbers that described eternity rather than counting days. Across these civilizations, Maya, Chinese, Indian, the materials changed: stone, bronze, clay, and ink. The languages changed, the rituals varied, but beneath all of them pulsed the same search. Every people in their own corner of the earth reached upward not to escape, but to belong. To know where they were in the great design, to align life with something steady when everything else shifted. The pyramids and observatories, the carved tablets and dripping clocks were all instruments of listening. They listened to the slow rhythm of creation, to the breath of time itself. Each shadow cast by the sun, each reflection of the moon on water, was a note in that silent music. Even now, centuries later, when the jungle has reclaimed the temples and dust covers the observatories, the precision of those moments remains. Sunlight still finds the same corners of stone at the same hour each year. The stars still rise above the same mountains. What they built endures not only in ruins, but in rhythm, the shared heartbeat of civilizations that, without knowing one another, dreamed the same dream. To find order in the sky so they might find peace on the earth. And so, from the humid jungles to the dry plateaus, from riverbanks to palace courtyards, humanity learned to speak in the language of light. The calendars and instruments, the symbols and alignments were all variations of one gesture, a steady, upward gaze, seeking to understand how the heavens moved so that the heart might move with them. From the temples of the east to the pyramids of the west, the sky had long been observed, revered, and recorded, but in time, another people looked upward and asked a different kind of question. In Greece, the heavens were not only something to honor, they became something to understand. The Greeks lifted their gaze to the stars, and instead of seeing gods alone, they began to see structure. The same light that had once inspired devotion now called for thought. In quiet courtyards of marble and stone, men bent over sand tables, drawing circles, tracing angles, and marking the paths of planets. They wrote numbers beside stars, not prayers. They did not ask the sky for mercy, they asked for meaning. Equations replaced incantations. The arcs of constellations became lines on parchment, and geometry grew like a new language, a bridge between the visible and the invisible. With compass and stylus, they built models of the world, not to command it, but to see it more clearly. A circle drawn by hand became a reflection of perfection, a symbol of the order that might lie behind the seeming chaos of the heavens. They spoke of harmony, proportion, and logic, ideas as clean as the light that bathed their coastal cities. Each night, when the stars emerged over the Aegean, they no longer represented capricious gods or fate's design. They were points in a pattern, pieces of an immense and measurable whole. Pythagoras listened for music in the motion of the planets, the harmony of spheres. Aristotle sought to define the causes behind celestial movement. Hipparchus recorded the first catalogue of stars, assigning them brightness and position. And then, much later, Ptolemy charted the cosmos into maps that would guide sailors and scholars for centuries. Their work turned wonder into discipline. To measure the stars was to learn restraint. To calculate was to listen. Where earlier civilizations had built temples aligned with constellations, the Greeks built systems of thought aligned with reason. The universe, once divine and unknowable, became something that could be described, not diminished, but understood. And yet, even as they calculated and proved, they did not lose reverence. The beauty they found in numbers was no less spiritual than the songs once sung to the gods. For in measuring the heavens, they discovered themselves, finite beings capable of reaching toward the infinite, not through prayer, but through thought. From their ink and sand and silence, the sky gained a new form, not myth, not memory, but system, an architecture of reason drawn across eternity. And so across centuries and continents the same truth quietly endures. From the clay tablets of Babylon to the marble observatories of Greece, from temples cut into stone to the fragile lines of ink on parchment, all point to one shared inheritance. Every civilization in its own way looked upward and found rhythm. The sky has never spoken in words, yet it has always been heard. Its pulse guided farmers and emperors, priests and philosophers. It marked beginnings and endings, floods and harvests, journeys and returns. People measured it, mapped it, sang to it, built for it. And through that long listening, they discovered something greater than the stars themselves, the order that exists when attention becomes devotion. What remains is not just knowledge, but a habit of wonder, a willingness to pause, to observe, to trust the patterns that move beyond human hands. Though our instruments have changed, from shadows to satellites, from water clocks to atomic ones, the act is still the same. We lift our gaze, we listen, we learn. The sky has rhythm, and humanity, for all its noise and hunger, has always known how to listen. The Louisiana Purchase, when the map unfolded. Centuries later, the sky was no longer the map. Paper was. Ink began to replace stars as the way people marked their world. Across a heavy wooden table, two nations faced each other, the air thick with ceremony, with the faint scent of wax and oil lamps. Between them lay a sheet of parchment, smooth and pale, waiting for the weight of decisions that would change the shape of land itself. A treaty. A signature. The quiet scratch of quills across the page. It seemed simple, just words, written in careful loops, sealed with emblems pressed into warm wax. Yet within those lines, invisible borders began to form. Territories expanded and contracted, not by rivers or mountains, but by sentences. The world was being redrawn in ink. Outside the chamber, the land itself remained unchanged, wild, vast, breathing. Winds crossed from one kingdom to the next without hesitation. Forests stretched across both sides, unbothered by the geometry of men. Somewhere beyond the edges of the map, rivers twisted through valleys no one had walked, and mountains slept under snow that belonged to no crown. No one at the table truly knew what those lands contained, what soil, what people, what history hidden beneath their roots. They only knew that space meant power, and power required paper. The explorers would come later, carrying compasses, guns, and dreams of order. But for now it was only ink, drying quietly under lamplight, deciding the fate of places unseen. When the last signature was done, the men exhaled and stood. The parchment was rolled, sealed, and carried away like something sacred. Outside, night had already fallen. The stars, once the only boundary humanity could measure, shone faintly above, indifferent to the new lines being drawn below. And so, after the treaties were signed and ink had fixed invisible borders, came the age of movement, when lines on parchment had to be touched by footsteps. From ports and capitals, expeditions began to leave, small groups of men with notebooks, compasses, and fragile courage. They were not kings or conquerors, they were listeners of the land, scribes of the unknown. The ships set sail before dawn, sails drawn tight against the wind. The sea stretched ahead, indifferent and endless. Weeks later, when they reached the far coasts promised by the maps, the world opened like an unfinished sentence. They carried ink and paper, and with every mile, the white of their pages filled with rivers, mountains, and forests that no one at home had ever seen. They recorded everything: the shape of a coastline, the call of an unfamiliar bird, the way a mountain's shadow fell across the plain. Their handwriting was careful, the ink steady, even as their hands trembled from cold or exhaustion. On some pages the marks wavered, the trace of a storm, the memory of hunger. Yet still they wrote, because the act of writing for them was the act of knowing. Through rain and heat, through the sharp cold of snow-covered passes, they walked and measured. They dipped their pens in melted ice, their fingers stiff and bruised. They drew the curve of rivers that had no names, the ridges of mountains that split the clouds. Each drawing was both a discovery and a confession, a way of admitting that the world was larger than understanding. In dense forests, the air smelled of sap and rot. In the deserts, the sun burned their shadows into the sand. At night, they camped under skies they could not name, listening to the cries of creatures that watched them from the dark. Sometimes they wrote by the flicker of a small flame, their pages speckled with ash. "The air here is thin," one might write. "The trees whisper. And then another page, water found. Clear and cold, they were not searching for gold or conquest. What drove them was a quiet hunger to see, to mark, to understand. Their notebooks filled with drawings of plants, animals, and tracks. They described leaves by their texture, stones by their weight, light by the way it moved. Each word became a bridge between distance and comprehension. When they finally returned, those who survived, their journals were passed from hand to hand. Scholars bent over them, tracing the lines with reverence. The explorers' handwriting, once a private effort against wind and solitude, became the new language of knowledge. The world began to expand not through war, but through description. The explorers had gone into the unknown with only instruments and patience, and they returned with something more enduring than territory. The understanding that discovery was not about possession, but observation. The Earth had been there all along, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it, and to write it down. Their maps, inked with rivers, forests, and silence, would become the new constellations, not in the sky, but on paper. The maps returned from those long journeys began to circulate through the hands of scholars, rulers, and merchants. Each one shimmered faintly with the illusion of clarity. Lines for rivers, dots for towns, wide spaces left blank for what had not yet been seen. But the truth beneath the ink was far more intricate, for those lands that seemed so new on parchment had, in fact, been lived in for centuries. Villages already stood where explorers had marked empty plains. Children played near rivers that now bore foreign names. Smoke rose from cooking fires whose existence no one at the drafting tables could imagine. Across those vast spaces, mountains, forests, valleys, there were already paths worn smooth by bare feet, songs that named the seasons, and graves that marked generations. The people of those places did not think in borders. They followed the language of rivers, the roots of animals, the rhythm of planting and return. Their world was fluid, drawn not in ink, but in memory, in story, in repetition. The explorers' maps could not capture that. And so the new lines began to cross the old ones, clean geometry laid over invisible histories. On the maps, everything looked simple. Mountains became triangles, forests became patches of green, and rivers curved obediently toward the sea. But in the real world, the land resisted neatness. A path that looked straight on paper wound endlessly through ravines. A border cut through a valley, where families on both sides shared the same fire each winter. No one shouted, not yet. The moment was too early for anger or consequence. The explorers had returned, the ink had dried, and the people on the other side of those lines went on with their lives. Hunting, trading, singing, tending to their fields. They had no reason to know that the world had been renamed around them. Somewhere, in a quiet study far away, a scholar traced those same maps with admiration, unaware that each clean stroke had replaced something lived. A field, a path, a story told beside firelight. The land, meanwhile, continued its steady breathing. The rivers still rose with the rain. The mountains stood, indifferent, watching as new names began to settle on their slopes. Nothing dramatic happened. No clash of empires, no thunder of conquest, just the soft layering of one way of seeing over another. Ink over earth, silence over memory. In time, the maps would multiply. They would hang on walls, folded in libraries, carried in pockets. But beneath every drawn line remained the same quiet truth, that the land had always belonged first to those who listened to it, not those who measured it. At first, the change was slow. A few footprints where none had been, a handful of tents near a bend in the river. But once the maps were finished and the routes marked clear, movement began in earnest. Paths became roads, roads became trade lines, and soon the quiet land that had once belonged only to wind and water began to fill with sound. Caravans arrived from distant cities bringing fabric, tools and words in unfamiliar tongues. Timber was cut, stone laid, fences raised. Fields that once swayed untouched under wild grass were ploughed into order. Smoke rose from new chimneys, straight and thin against the horizon. The world, it seemed, had quickened. The people came with hope. Farmers looking for soil, merchants for passage, families for safety. They followed the trails first traced by explorers, unaware that beneath their boots were older paths, softer and unmarked, leading toward forgotten springs and sacred groves. Where once a single fire burned in solitude, now a dozen lights shimmered through the dusk. Markets grew where rivers met, filled with the clatter of trade, grain, salt, cloth, stories. New names were given to old places, some misheard, some misremembered. Languages blended at crossroads, creating accents that belonged to no single home. The rhythm of life changed. What had been slow and cyclical became forward and linear, driven by purpose, by the promise of progress. But the land itself never protested. It adjusted quietly, reshaping itself around the noise. The forests receded a little farther each season, the rivers thickened with boats, and fields stretched in neat rows toward the horizon. The seasons still turned, but the hands that worked them had changed. For those who remembered how things once were, the older hunters, the elders of small villages, the change felt like a shifting heartbeat. The mornings began earlier, the nights shorter. Silence grew rare. Yet even they, with time, learned to live within the new rhythm, to trade as others traded, to measure their lives not only by the stars, but by the clock. Cities followed, first small, then sprawling. Roads cut through forests, bridges crossed wide valleys, and travelers carried stories faster than the wind ever could. What had once been the quiet edge of a map now pulsed with motion, carts creaking, hammers echoing, children calling out in streets built where fields once lay. No one commanded it. It simply happened. The way rivers find the sea, inevitable and continuous. Expansion was not a decision, but a momentum. And so history moved again, not as a rupture, but as a change of tempo. The old rhythms of planting and harvest, of migration and return, blended with new ones, the hum of trade, the strike of iron, the steady march of wheels on dust. The world did not stop to mourn what it replaced. It simply kept breathing, faster now, louder, full of names and lights and movement. The maps, once empty, were filled. The borders that began as faint lines grew heavy with meaning. But beneath the noise of growth, a softer continuity endured. The same earth beneath the roads, the same sky above the rooftops, and the same quiet pulse of life, adjusting once again to a new rhythm of time. Centuries passed, and the once wild expanse found its place among the nations of the world. What had begun as ink on a treaty, as the careful steps of explorers, as the first murmurs of trade, now appeared on every modern map, colored and bordered, threaded with highways and cities. From the sky, it looks complete, a pattern of fields, rooftops and light, a territory named and catalogued. Yet the land beneath all that remembers otherwise. When rain falls after long heat, the scent of soil rises, carrying traces of paths no longer walked. In the countryside, ploughs sometimes uncover fragments of stone tools, bits of pottery, bones that once lay beneath fireside songs. Beneath the asphalt of new roads, the shapes of older trails still exist, faint as scars. The present has been built so thickly that few notice, but the earth keeps its memory patiently, layer by layer. At dusk, when the air grows still, the land seems to breathe differently. Wind moves through the grass the same way it did before the first fence was drawn. A bird crosses the horizon along a route older than the maps that now define it. The new cities hum with life, yet somewhere below that hum lingers the rhythm of footsteps that once moved slower, softer, without destination. Every place holds its ghosts, not of people, but of patterns. The curve of a field that once was forest. The name of a stream that hides an older word. The ground still whispers to those who pause long enough to listen. And so, the land remains what it has always been. A page written over many times, each layer both covering and preserving the one before. On the surface, it belongs to the present. But just beneath, in the cool dark of soil and silence, the old paths still murmur. Faint reminders that before there were borders, there were simply ways of walking and the sound of wind over open ground. The voice softens, the air settles. Words no longer explain. They drift, slow and steady, like the last pulse of a fading tide. What began as noise, as movement and building, returns now to stillness. The story breathes out. History, when told gently, loses its edges. It becomes less about battles and borders and more about textures. The sound of a door closing, the hush of waves folding back into themselves, the faint creak of wood beneath bare feet. It is not a sequence of events, but an atmosphere that lingers, moving through time as quietly as smoke. If you listen long enough, you can hear it. The wind brushing through fields that used to be forests. The rivers that still run along their ancient beds, even as bridges and cities lean above them. The echo of footsteps on wooden floors. Those who built, those who left, those who simply passed through. All of them still here, in rhythm. Every era carries its own tempo. Some fast and bright, others heavy and slow. But beneath all change, a deeper beat continues. The one that connects every generation to the next, every silence to the sound that follows. The pulse of what endures. And now, as the voice fades, the rhythm remains. Quiet, steady, familiar. History exhales, and what's left is not the weight of what was done, but the cadence of what keeps being lived. In this final hush, everything falls back into place. Wind, river, footsteps, breath. Each time, each life, each telling, part of the same unending rhythm. And in the dark, where words finally dissolve, that rhythm still moves. Soft, even, alive.